Navigating an SAP transformation? We get it. By day, we work hands-on with people like you across the globe. By night, we share what actually works. Welcome to Transformation Every Day with Alexander Greb and Johannes Languth, where your complex transformation becomes clear, actionable, and achievable.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Alexander Greb. I'm Consulting Director at CBS Corporate Business Solutions, and this is Transformation Every Day, expert insights and stories on SAP and beyond. In SAP transformation programs, we see it frequently. New technology arrives, and users and some consultants immediately look for reasons not to adopt it. Change resistance, legacy thinking, we've always done it this way. LinkedIn is full of that. Now imagine the exact opposite mindset. Welcome to Formula One. Our guest today, Marc Priestley, spent 10 years as chief mechanic at McLaren Racing, working with drivers like Lewis Hamilton, Fernando Alonso, and Kimi Räikkönen, and innovators like Adrian Newey, in a world where standing still means losing. In Formula One, every rule change, every disruption, every new tool is treated as a chance to gain an advantage, not something to fear. Continuous reinvention isn't a slogan, it's survival. Marc's new book, Pitlane Lessons, takes that mindset and applies it to organizations struggling with the same challenges our SAP listeners face today. Innovation fatigue, slow decision-making, and teams stuck in old habits. In this episode, we explore how Formula One's culture of hyper-performance, the detail obsession of leaders like Ron Dennis, and rapid adoption can help any SAP program move past resistance and truly transform. Welcome to Transformation Every Day. This is Marc Priestley.
There's a lot of research in this book, so it was quite heavy going at times. So it took me a long time. So to finally get the book out there is this amazing sort of sense of relief and this feeling where other people can finally start to see it. Because I guess the point of this book is to try and help people. That's literally what it's about. It's trying to help people who won't have the privileged experience that I've been lucky enough to have. So, now it's in their hands, and hopefully it's doing good things for them.
I found out when I wrote my book, the perfect time for that was during COVID, where you basically had nothing to do anyway. You were stuck and try to make something which made sense out of your time. And I fully agree. It's quite hard to motivate yourself when you have to do this in the evenings after the kids are in bed and all the stuff like that.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, you still have a real job to do at the same time for most people, so it is tricky. But it's also those tricky things are all often the nicest to finally complete. The sense of achievement is even greater because it was hard. So I feel good about it. I'm very proud of it. Very pleased that it's now out there and people are starting to read it. And so far, all the feedback's been great. So I'm happy.
Awesome. And I'm absolutely pleased to have you in the podcast today. We have Marc Priestley, which is an incredible honor because I'm a fan for years of yours, and you're a very special person because before you introduce yourself, you have been at the forefront of basically what I am struggling with in my job and my industry struggling every single day. Disruption, new technology, trying to cope with change. You had to do it on a daily basis because you worked in Formula One in a very prominent position as the chief mechanic of McLaren, working with people like Fernando Alonso, Lewis Hamilton, Kimi Räikkönen in the world, I think, it cannot get more complex and demanding like Formula One.
Yeah, it's a fascinating world. It really is, because it's at the forefront of all of those things you've mentioned. I think because the world is so highly competitive, obviously, and that competition is very public. So it's being played out in front of the world, but also it's a competition at the very highest level. The people involved in Formula One, from the drivers to the engineers and mechanics and everybody within each of the 10, soon to be 11 Formula One teams are the best of the best. They're elite level in that industry and in their roles. And so when you talk about intense competition amongst a group of elite level people, you're talking about the tiniest margins that separate one from the other. And so this idea of continually reinventing yourself, continual transformation. I mean, there's a saying in Formula One that I think sums all this up, which is, if you stand still, you get left behind. And
Yeah.
it's so true in this sport more than most industries because of the relentless pace of kind of innovation and transformation and the rate that everyone is having to move forward.
Absolutely. And I think normal people in air marks, normal people like us, they are entering this world in a similar way now, because I think we, in the last 10 years, with digitalization catching up, basically any industry at the moment is heavily disrupted. Yeah, being the normal computer stuff, being mobile phones. Now I worked a lot with the German automotive industry, yeah, and it was considered for years and years and years as being completely invincible. Yeah, now disruption also has caught up with these people, and everybody of us is finding that disruption, that having to adapt to new things, which you at the first cannot really control, yeah, because you have to react, are things that are difficult. And those things for you were basically a normal day at the office.
Well, to some extent, that is true. First of all, I would say that everybody involved in Formula One, they are normal people as well. They're normal people, as I am. It's just that you go through an experience, and I spent 10 years at McLaren. I came out the other side absolutely thinking differently to most people. That doesn't make me in any way special, but I've just been trained and brought up, if you like, through my 20s and 30s in a way that makes me think in this kind of, in this way, think that these things are normal. So you're absolutely right. The idea of continuous innovation, for looking for opportunity in absolutely everywhere, even the smallest opportunities, for me is a sort of baseline. It's not something extraordinary, which is it's what it is in many industries. And I now work with lots of organizations across many industries trying to help them think more like Formula One teams do. And when I came out of the sport, I realized that I do think differently. I have this ability, just because it's been drummed into me that that's the normal, that I think differently to most people. So, you touched there on the automotive industry, not just in Germany, but across the world. For a long time, many industries, particularly that one, has been a sort of almost a closed shop, in that they've had the big players in the game, and we all know who they are, and they've not had too much in the way of new competition. It's always been a game. It's been played by those few big parties, the big names in the industry, which means when you don't have new competition coming in very frequently, it's very comfortable. It's an easy place to operate. No one pushes each other that hard. The rate of change is relatively slow. The sort of market share you have is relatively big because there's not that many players in the game. And then in recent times, of course, that's totally changed. Not just in the automotive industry, by the way. Lots of industries have had the borders taken down, if you like. Now almost anybody can come and be a player. The automotive industry, as an example, we're seeing new car companies spring up almost weekly now from places like China and beyond. And electrification is a big part of that, why that's become more accessible. It's actually relatively easy, much more, or comparatively so, relatively easy to build an electric car. It's actually a simple set of components. So it means that you open up the sort of, or you take down the barriers to entry. And when you do that, you get disruption. You get new players coming in, the Teslas of this world, which did this a few years ago, and now many more, as I say, from China particularly, who are coming up with new ideas, who are thinking differently to the old school. And that means the old school, the established players in this game, are forced to try and think differently to survive. Because, you don't have to forecast too far into the future to say, well, the Volkswagens of this world, the Ford, the really established companies, if they don't start innovating quite rapidly and dramatically, everyone else around them is starting to, they will disappear off the marketplace. That seems an unthinkable thing to even say out loud, but it's not that far from reality. So this breakthrough of other players, of continual innovation, the automotive industry being a great example, is something that's forcing the incumbents to think very differently. And I think the difference with Formula One is that's how it's always been. There's always somebody thinking differently. There's always somebody innovating, coming up with a new idea. And it doesn't have to be a dramatically different new idea in our sport because the margins are so small, but they have to continue to be looking for them. So this idea of never being comfortable in what you do, never just settling for what you've got is a mindset that I think is just, as I said, a sort of baseline for survival, let alone success in the world that I've operated in for so long.
Hi there. Quick break for a short message before we go right back to the episode. Enjoying the insights and stories on transformation every day? Want to make sure you never miss an episode packed with practical tips and best practices from the SAP world, featuring conversations with some of the most interesting people in the SAP universe? Then hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform, whether it is Apple, Spotify, or any other you use. And if our podcast brings you value, we would be incredibly grateful if you could leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends and colleagues. Your support means the world to us. Thanks so much and happy listening.
And it's a good example that you made there, because I think there are many analogies that you can draw between Formula One and our industries at the moment, with Formula One showing that dominance just happened for a few years for each team. Of course, it was now like Mercedes and so on had their share, definitely. Red Bull was following. But when you look for the last 15 years, you had 2 years where you could be safe was a very good idea, like the Lotus 78s and the carbon fiber chassis and so on. But then another one came up and so on. And after 2 years, we had Williams coming back into the game. And McLaren had his fair share of ups and downs going on. With these kinds of narrow frequencies of success, and then having to catch up and to disrupt out the competition again. Do you think that that has grown a certain breed of people by this kind of atmosphere and culture that they're living in, that you do not find anywhere else? Or do you say, like, okay, these are methods, or these are, let's say, ways of thinking that anybody of us can achieve?
Well, it's definitely a way of thinking. So it's a culture that's bred throughout the industry, and every one of the teams, their businesses, of course, in their own right, they have to have that culture. And it's prevalent across the board. Like I say, it's the way most people in this sport just think as a baseline. Can anyone else think that way? Absolutely. And this is what I spend my life doing today. I go into organizations all around the world, working with them to try and help them think that way. I've just written a book, it's called Pitlane Lessons, and it's just come out. And it's the point of that book is to help people to think like a Formula One team. In fact, the mantra that I use for it, the sort of tagline, if you like, is, no matter what challenge you might be facing in your life or your career, if you're able to think about it as if it were a Formula One team thinking about that same challenge, you will almost certainly come out the other side in a better place. And it's because of the way that Formula One teams think is about minute levels of detail. It's about continuously reinventing and looking at almost with a blank sheet of paper. It's not just evolving an idea one day from another. Of course, we do that, but we're always in the background taking a fresh look in case we've missed something, in case there's a new opportunity. You think about the rules in Formula One, they're continually changing. The parameters of the game we're playing, it's like the goalposts are being moved every year. So you can become extremely good at maximizing a set of rules. For example, we think about Mercedes and the dominance that they had. And then when the rules changed, it was actually Red Bull that did a better job in that early part. And they became, top players. So there's always something changing, which you can look at as being a really destabilizing effect. You can say, well, that's not fair. We've done a really good job of making turning out a great car, building a great organization within this rule set. So we shouldn't be penalized for you suddenly changing that. But that's not how Formula One teams think. They always think about the opportunity. Every time there's a rule change, even if you're dominating the sport, it's an opportunity to do something better than the competition. Every disruption comes with opportunities. Of course, it can come with destabilization. It can mean the brilliant idea that made your car half a second quicker than everyone else is suddenly no longer relevant. But we don't focus on that bit. We focus on the bit that says, well, there's a new set of rules, which means there are gaping holes and opportunities everywhere to exploit. And that is this mindset. So to answer your question, absolutely anyone can think like that. It's not just something you can tell somebody to think. If you're in an organization that's about building a culture, and an environment that enables people to think that way. And we can get into what that looks like. But this isn't a situation, and it's not how it works in Formula One teams, where the boss, the CEO doesn't come in every day and say, right, I want you all to be innovative today. That's not how it works. They've built an organization where innovation is just spawned naturally throughout the organization because of the environment that they've created within it. And anyone can do that.
You worked for 10 years for a guy who was very prominent in how to induce innovation, these kinds of innovative thinking into organizations, which is Ron Dennis. And Ron Dennis himself, he was a manager of innovation. He had his people, like John Barnard or Adrian Newey, who were the inventors themselves. In most of the cases, he did not do these kinds of innovations himself, but he was the one building the groundwork and fostering these kinds of possibilities and make them happen. How important are these people for their organizations, and what can leaders learn from a guy like Ron Dennis?
Yeah, a lot is the answer in terms of what people can learn and leaders can learn. Ron was an inspirational leader. He wasn't perfect by any stretch, as nobody is, and actually in the modern day, his leadership style probably wouldn't work anywhere near as well today as it did back then. But there are still some things that I think he did extraordinarily well, and that we still think about using a lot today throughout this sport, that he was the first, or we at McLaren were the first to break through. I think his attention to detail was second to none. I've never met anybody who has the same obsession on details. And there's a chapter in the new book about focusing on Ron and exactly that, attention to detail being a real key differentiator. But of course, the key is learning to focus on the right details. Very often we waste time working on details that don't matter or are not going to make it. Yeah, exactly. And also working on the finer details when you haven't got the basic details right underneath all of that. So, which becomes pointless. Ron was very good at those finer details, but he was also very good as part of that, of building an environment where the entire company would operate on that level. And that means employing great people who think along those lines. The likes of Adrian Newey, who I worked with for years at McLaren under Ron. Adrian was the kind of guy who is detail obsessed, just like Ron is, slightly in a slightly different way, but he was still focused on the details that mattered to him. Designing the car, he would be there all hours of the day and night on a great big drawing board, doing it old school, not sitting at a computer screen, but drawing on his great big drawing board, but obsessing over some tiny, tiny details that most people wouldn't even give a second look at. And that was one of the things that always stood out to me about Adrian Newey, was his obsession about the tiny things. And sometimes those tiny things became a real pain in the backside for me as a mechanic back in my early career. Parts that became incredibly difficult to change, for example. But they were there and they were difficult to change because there was an inherent opportunity or an inherent advantage in designing it that way. Like there was an aero advantage in not having a little slot gap in a component, which made it easier to change because he was obsessed about the aero advantage. He didn't care so much that it took a bit longer to change because that wasn't his problem. That was someone else's problem. And we'd factor that in. What mattered was performance because that's what we were optimizing for. So those details were something that I think McLaren was run upon. And if you're thinking about advice for leaders, the one thing I would say that really stood out for Ron was never a leader that came along and demanded everybody focus on details without him doing it himself. He lived the way that he expected everybody else to operate. And we could see that. And when your leader is operating and living that obsessive lifestyle, that obsessive, showing up at work in that obsessive, detail-focused way, and we can all see that. It's so obvious and so public. We know what's expected without him ever saying anything about that. And that's what sets the tone of a culture like this in an organization. So from a leadership perspective, one of the things that I've taken and I use a lot in my business world today is the idea of a leader wanting to set a culture or set the tone for a culture in the organization. You have to live that culture as well. You have to set that tone and live it every single day. No one's going to respect you turning up and saying, right, I want you all to focus on details when they're not doing it themselves. the respect goes out the window. You have to live what you expect everyone else to do within your organization as a leader. And that was one of the biggest lessons I think I took away from working under Ron for so long.
Of course, not everybody has the incredible luck to work in such a exciting industry for such a high-performing organization like McLaren. Most of us, mankind, men and women, also listening to you, they're having their job. They're probably working at companies who are trying to be innovative and so on, but like most of them do, organizations are maybe probably not as performant. What kind of advice can be given to that kind of person stuck in the middle of, let's say, medium performing organizations? What kind of change can one single person in that way do without being in a prominent position like a leader like Ron Dennis?
Well, the first bit of advice is go buy the new book because that's exactly what it's about. It's literally about that. It's giving, as you said, I was very fortunate to work for 10 years for this amazing organization. And I came out the other side of that, like I said earlier on, thinking differently to everybody else in the world or to most people. This book and what I do today is about sharing that and trying to help other people to think in the same way. So, all jokes aside, that is exactly the point of me writing this book, is to try and help people to think that way. But more specifically, there's actually a little anecdote in the book. When I was a mechanic at McLaren, and so fairly far down the sort of food chain, if you like, in my early part of the career, and I could see a lot that could be improved with the culture of our organization. This was way back in the early 2000s. I had no leadership role in my title. I wasn't a manager. I was simply what was called a number 2 mechanic back then. So a long way down the hierarchy. But I could see all around me problems that I thought were relatively easy to fix in terms of the way people felt, the way that people felt about working there. There were people that were frustrated, that didn't feel valued. And I could see all this around me. I had people moaning at me all the time. And I was sitting there thinking, well, this is my dream job. I'm forever going to be grateful to be here. And yet all these people who've been here a long time are moaning. And so I took it upon myself to go and make an appointment to go and see Ron Dennis and Martin Whitmarsh, who were the CEO and the sort of the chairman of the company at the time. And I just made an appointment, which I was terrified to go and do. And I went in and I sat at the desk and told them everything that I thought was wrong. And it wasn't just, moaning myself. It wasn't just saying what was wrong, but I went there with a plan, or at least some suggestions on how we could improve those things. And, that led into, and I won't go into the whole story, but that led into a complete new role for me at the team, where they appreciated that feedback because they weren't getting it from everywhere. And having got that feedback from the shop floor, a place that they probably felt quite disconnected from at times, they suddenly had this realization that if we wanted to be the best team in the world in Formula One, we want to operate at such a high level, these things matter. The way people feel matter. If people are moaning, they're clearly not giving their best. We're not going to get the best out of them. And so together we set about trying to address that. So that was an example of me not being a leader by name, by job title. There was nothing on my business card that said I was that. But I had something in me that felt that I could make a positive change, or at least lead or help someone else to make a positive change, which is how I initially thought about this. And it was just being brave enough to step up and go and, give that feedback. And the reality is that if you want to make a change in your organization, if you're frustrated about the way things are, you can sit and moan like everybody else. That's the truth. That's what a lot of people were doing at McLaren. Or you can go and try and do something about it. And the truth is, you'll probably find, almost certainly find, the real leaders in your organization, the people at the very top of the tree, will be supremely grateful for what you go and tell them. Not just going in and slagging everybody off and saying how rubbish it all is, but going with suggestions from a part of the business that they may not be directly connected to or familiar with, suggestions that can make things better. Because if you think about the CEO of your organization or the boss further up the chain, their motivation is just to get the company operating at the highest level possible. And yes, it might be because it translates into a better bottom line figure for them and profits and bonuses. And that doesn't matter. Whatever specific motivation it is, the point is the company has to be operating at the highest level for everybody to get what they want out of this. And so if you, at some low level, relatively speaking, in the organization, go and give that feedback, that is a massive plus to the guy sitting at the very top of that tree. And so almost certainly it'll be well received. If it's delivered in the right way, with suggestions, not just moaning, with suggestions to make it better, almost certainly in almost all cases, the CEO or the boss is going to be really grateful for that feedback. And not only can it help to change the organization, which it did in my case at McLaren, but it could also change your prospects within the company. It could change the way you're seen. It could change your career trajectory. So I will always encourage people, if you think you can do something better, or you think there's a better way of doing something in your organization that's currently holding you back or frustrating you, go and tell someone that can make a difference. Make the appointment. Think about how you're going to do it in a constructive way, but go and do it. What have you got to lose?
And it's interesting what you said, because with them giving you or empowering you to actually fix parts of these problems by giving you this kind of position, it shows again what a high-performing organization should do. Yeah, of course, it should foster positivity and initiative and so on, but then it needs those people who say, hey, let me take care of that. Yeah, and if you have an idea, make it happen. Definitely.
Exactly. You know, as I said, you think about the executive suite at in your organization. Their literal job is to try and improve all aspects of the company. And if they suddenly get a gift, which is what it is, from someone further down the organization coming along and saying, look, you may not have noticed, but this is not working properly. Here's an idea to fix it. That's a gift. You know, they're going to go to their bosses, to the shareholders or whatever else, looking like heroes because they've potentially improved something or fixed a problem, and you could be the catalyst for that. And it passes down through the organization. So it's not just about personal glory. It's not just about career progression. It's about making the environment in which you work in one that's going to be better for you. Because if the only thing that happens is some of those things that are frustrating you get better, you're going to be less frustrated. And if that's the minimum that happens, it's a clear improvement for you and your daily lives and your daily routine. So why wouldn't you do that? Part of the reason you don't do that often is that the company organization, the culture, makes that feel very difficult to do. And that's where a company can start to improve. At McLaren, for me, at that time, that was a very difficult thing to do. We didn't encourage that. There weren't obvious and clear channels for those kind of suggestions to happen, which is why, for me, making that really bold move and going straight to the very top was a really, I guess, out of the box thing for me to do. And perhaps back then, and I was, in my early 20s at the time, perhaps that says something about the kind of character that I was back then. I was, on this path where I just wanted to get to a really high level personally, but also as a company. I wanted to win the world championship. And I was looking around me in what was still an elite organization. We were operating at an incredibly high level at McLaren, but there were areas where we were missing a trick, and back then, we used to focus all our attention on the car. That was everything. All of the resource, the time and energy was about making the car faster. We'd massively overlooked the people in our business and how they felt and what the environment was like for them. That was a gaping opportunity that I saw, and it was just a case of bringing that to somebody's attention. And I chose to go straight to the very top to do that because I felt at the time the channels through which we might have been able to do that normally, which might have been going to my line manager, and there were so many layers within the organization, I never felt that confident it would ever get to someone who could make the difference. So I thought, well, sod it, I'll go straight to the top. And I would advise people to start thinking that way if you're in an organization where you're frustrated, you think there are ways to make things better. You may not always get the answer that you want, and it may not be that easy to fix some of the challenges that you're facing, but you can't ever, in my opinion, sit there and moan unless you are prepared to try and do something to fix it.
Absolutely. And I think the important part, as you underlined, is there not just saying, hey, this is wrong, but this could be the solution. Yeah, the positivity, the improvement there. And I think one of the parts that you mentioned is especially important and interesting because I love pit stops, the choreography and the effect. And if you look at the development of pit stops, with Gordon Murray introducing the first time changing wheels, refueling, and all that stuff, to what it has become, which is a highly choreographed, high performance, high athletics, in a few seconds thing that is happening there with so much optimization behind of that. It is absolutely astonishing. And I remember I was at the Italian Grand Prix in Monza. I think it was in 2006. Probably,
Yeah,
I guess you were there.
I was
And
there.
you were there, and I was in the stands right across the pit lane, and I was recording with my camera the pit stops. And then when I was back home, because I was in the time before YouTube, I was in slow motion, really
Yeah.
looking for dozens of times how these kinds of movements there. I realized that the movements are all the same every time because they are so highly optimized. What kind of team atmosphere or team behaviors, rituals are in there in such a high performing team, which storms out when the car is coming in, rips the tires off, does the refueling, gets the car running again after a few seconds only, doing a thing for which other people would probably need hours.
Yeah, I mean, I love pit stops too. I think they're an
Yeah.
incredible feat of sort of human engineering as well as technical
Yeah.
engineering. And that's what it is. It's a combination of incredible innovation around the technology. So that's the car, the equipment that we use, the technology and the wheel guns and the jacks and all of these systems around a pit stop are just as cutting edge as you find, buried under the bodywork of a car. And it's continual innovation in that process. So we're always looking to improve the way we operate around a pit stop, but also on a human engineering side, if you like, the sort of feat of human performance is always something still that we're trying to improve and innovate through as well. So you're right. You just said it's athletic. So we now train the pit stop crew almost like the athletes in which we, the way we approach drivers. We go through the training mechanism of repeating pit stops, of course, thousands of pit stops to commit those movements to muscle memory. They are highly choreographed movements. We use slow motion cameras to look down from the overhead gantry in the pit stop to monitor positions and movements frame by frame to understand where people are going to be, how they're moving in sync with each other, to try and make this so choreographed that it's seamless. But on top of that, we're also making sure that everybody's fit, and we give tailored fitness regimes to different jobs around the crew. So, if you're putting on a nose cone, for example, which was the first job I ever did in a pit stop, it's quite a heavy piece of equipment. It's big. Health and safety would tell you to sort of bend at the knees and keep a straight back and all those things we've heard so many times. You can't do that in a pit stop. It would take you forever. And so we have to mitigate around that by optimizing for performance while still covering off the safety aspect. And so we train for those people, for example, we train a specific training regime that strengthens the core, strengthens the back muscles, so that we can do things for those couple of seconds in a way that, you wouldn't tell people at work to lift a box off a shelf, but a way that's fast and safe and repeatable. We need to look after the sort of the mental side of the pit stop crew just as much. And we do that now using sports psychologists, for example. Coping with the pressure of a pit stop is a massive part of things. The movements involved in a pit stop are actually relatively simple. Whatever you do, you have a small part in a big process. Your bit is over in a fraction of a second, and it's often a really simple movement. If you describe the movement of any individual around that crew, it sounds so easy. But then you put it onto race day when there's a championship at stake and your main rival's doing the same thing 20 feet further down the pit lane, it becomes a very different thing. And that's all about what's up here in your mind. So training those individuals to cope with that pressure, to stay calm under pressure, to harness the pressure as a positive rather than a negative. These are all things that we spend a lot of time now trying to optimize for. So we even go as far as nutrition, making sure that everybody's eating well, eating healthily, eating the right foods over the course of a race weekend to try and peak in our best physical and mental state on a Sunday afternoon when it matters. So we're looking at the tiniest details. And as I said, we're always innovating on all of those things. There's a really nice story in the book, which is a technical innovation, but I want to tell you the story because it's one of my favorite around pit stops, and it involves refueling, which is what you touched on a moment ago. Refueling back in the day was every team had exactly the same refueling rig, and the rules stated that you weren't allowed to modify that in any way for safety reasons. So we all had this same rig. When the car stopped, you'd have to jam the rig onto the side of the valve on the car. Once it was attached, you'd pre-program the amount of fuel you wanted to flow in, and it would flow through. And when the fuel had been delivered, this big motorized valve in the nozzle that you were holding on the car would close. And when it was finally closed and everything was safe and the fuel had stopped flowing, these little green lights would appear on the nozzle. And that meant you could start the sort of clunky 2-stage process to disconnect it. Now, that was always the slowest part of a pit stop. So the wheels had already been changed by that point. You're waiting for this fuel nozzle to finally be disconnected before you can release the car. Now, we couldn't modify the rig, but I remember going into the R&D department at McLaren one day, and a guy had just come back from the doctors, having had a health checkup. And he came in, he said, I've had this idea. He said, we could run a doctor's stethoscope down the sleeve of the refueler in the pit stop crew. So he has the one end in his ear, and the bit that the doctor holds on your chest to listen to your heart is popped out the sleeve of the refueler. When the nozzle's jammed onto the car and the fuel's being delivered, he can hold that little end of the stethoscope against the fuel nozzle and hear when the fuel stopped flowing and this motorized valve begins closing inside the nozzle. Now, he can hear that through the stethoscope over the noise of the engine. And so when he knows the fuel stopped flowing and it is safe, even though this valve is still closing, which took about a second, he could start disconnecting the nozzle. So by the time we got our green lights to say everything was done, we were already pretty much off. It was perfectly safe. We hadn't modified the rig in any way. And because it was just this little stethoscope running down the sleeve of somebody's race suit, nobody knew about it. And it was one of the best little secrets that saved us maybe a second in every pit stop for years, which a second, by the way, in pit stops is amazing. That's a huge chunk of time. And it was, as I said, it didn't break any rules. It was just about thinking completely differently. And so these are the kind of levels that I think I find fascinating about pit stops. There are so many great little stories of both technical and human innovation, which go into optimizing this group of 20 or 25 people to today being able to change tires and wheels in 1.8 seconds. And it's staggering.
Absolutely. And it shows like how thinking about how we actually do things makes a difference. And in your podcast, for example, talking about the kind of process, you told a similar story about, I think in 1 year, refueling was ruled out. So the whole process, I think, was not part of the whole pit stop anymore, which then could, of course, have led to saying like, okay, it's just, let's say, some steps of the pit stop that are falling out, and we continue our methodology as we did all the time, because it was perfect. It was highly, highly optimized. But you decided against that and you started from zero again, because you said, like, okay, there are now with that so many parameters changing that it needs our systematic needs a complete new overhaul, which is 100% what I experience every day with my customers, because we always tend to say like, okay, we have at one stage defined the way how to proceed a certain process in our company. And with new technology happening, for example, to cut out some steps, we just build on that. We just continue to innovate or improve what we already have instead of questioning the whole process at all again. What are the kind of reasons that you in those cases said like, no, let's start from a white paper again?
Yeah, it's a good example, actually, because if you think about pit stops with refueling, as I said, it was always the refueling which took longest. That was always the slowest part. And because of that, we were changing tires and then waiting for that refueling to finish. But because of that, the upshot was that although we were changing the wheels and tires very quickly, we never really had to optimize it as the priority, because always it was going to be the refueling that was the slowest part. If you remove the refueling, yes, we could have changed tires in really fast times. But if we were now looking at that as that being the limiting factor, we could look at optimizing that as the priority. So it's always about what you prioritize. We tend to achieve, all of us in life and business, we tend to achieve the thing we prioritize most. And that's not always what we say we're going to prioritize most. And I always give the example of, people saying that, they're going to get up and go to the gym in the morning and they set their alarm for 6 a.m. And then when the alarm goes off, they hit snooze. In that moment, you prioritize snoozing. You didn't prioritize going to the gym, even though you said that might be your priority. So thinking about what you honestly prioritize and truly prioritize is always the key to this. If you want to optimize something, and that absolutely is going to be your focus, go all in on that thing. And for us in pit stops, that suddenly became changing the wheels and tires. But what lies behind all of that is a part of a larger Formula One philosophy, which is often sort of referred to as first principle thinking, people often call it, where you always question everything on a regular basis and continue to question that until you get to the base level of what you think to be true. And then you work back up from there. And you just gave an example, which is a good one. So our version of a rule change, a regulation change in Formula One, when a regulation change comes along, it's very easy to say, well, we optimized this last time in the last rule set. We've become very good at it. So let's just continue down that path. Let's evolve it. But the new rule change might give you another opportunity that you hadn't yet or hadn't been available in the last rule set. And unless you go back to a blank sheet of paper and you reason your way back down to what we call first principles, the first basic principles that we know to be true, despite anything we might have done before, almost erase that to some extent, start a scratch and work your way back up. You might come to the same conclusion, but you might not. And it's that bit where you might not is where the opportunity often lies to do something better. So again, year to year, designing a component, when you've got the same designer designing, say, the pedals in a Formula One car, if he's done that job, if that person's done that job for 5 years straight, ingrained in their thinking is going to be what they've done before. And that's perfectly natural. We all tend to operate and evolve that way. So often a Formula One team will question what that person's done by putting the design in front of somebody else or getting somebody else to question that design. It's not an aggressive, why have you done it that way? It's not questioning their ability. It's not throwing doubt on what they've done. It's literally asking the question, why did you do it that way? And that's such a common question in a Formula One team that no one ever takes offense at it. It's a perfectly normal part of the process. And when you ask that question, why did you do it that way? And then you get an answer back. And if you continue to ask, yeah, but why? Why did you do that? Go down that route as far as you can get to until you get to, as I said, this sort of first principle, the basic principles. And then you start to work your way back up as if it were a fresh piece of paper. You often end up in a very different place to the one you would have been in if you just continually evolved. And that's important in Formula One for all those reasons I said at the start. If we just evolve something down the same path, we may well iteratively improve that every single year, but we might be missing a gaping opportunity that allows an even greater improvement because we're not thinking with these first principles in mind, with this blank sheet of paper. So it's often much easier to evolve what you know than it is to go back to basics, which is why most people don't do it. And in a company perspective, that can cost you a bit of time. If you're going to go to all of your designers or your creatives and say, forget everything you've done and start again, there's a time penalty for that. And you need to be comfortable with, with having that happen in the organization. There might be a cost associated to that extra time. But if the optimization is being set for the end performance, if the thing that matters, your top priority is truly the outcome, well, then that's the better way to do it. If the priority is the time, then maybe you just have to evolve what you've got. If you have to get it done quickly, maybe evolving something is the right way. But if the absolute priority, that moment I talked about where you either hit snooze or go to the gym, what's really the priority, truly deep down when you're really honest? If it's the end performance, going back to first principles almost always at least gives the opportunity for even greater improvement.
Somebody who is stuck in the corporate world and who's listening to us may, of course, say like, okay, but these guys are talking about Formula One. Formula One is excessive. They have lots of monies at their head. They throw money at problems, and it's so easy to innovate when you throw money at topics, which maybe in a certain way not completely wrong, because actually that happens. But I think that the past and the history of Formula One shows how small teams, creative teams, the British garagistas, for example, poked a nail in the butt of the big Italian teams, for example, for decades, and won by creativity and not only by money. Of course, corporations, they have, and you referred to that in one of your podcast episodes, of they have to operate efficient, and that's not always the first priority of a Formula One team. But how can organizations have a balance like this? Of course, doing their due diligence concerning efficiency, but not really fall into something like a sunk cost bias, which hinders innovation. Because I experience so many times that people say, yeah, I understand that this is a good idea and could bring us forward, but we spent, for the last time we improved that kind of process, we spent so much money, that we at first have to get the kind of money back from that kind of innovation back then before we can do another step.
Yeah, and that's all true. And it's all true for Formula One teams today. If you go back 10, 15, 20 years, it's exactly like you said. You could throw as much money as you could get your hands on at a problem to fix it. And we did do that. And if you ran out of money, you'd go to the sponsors and you say, look, we've had this great idea, but it's going to cost this much, but it could win us the championship. Yep. And the sponsors would throw you more money. And it was an unbelievable time to be in this sport. But actually, it was highly inefficient. It was hugely extravagant and unsustainable, which is why today Formula One operates in a budget-capped era, cost-capped era. Now, people will go, yeah, but it's still $135 million a season or whatever, which is a lot of money. It is. That's absolutely true. My argument against that is always, it's not about the amount of money you are willing to dedicate to innovation or to finding solutions to problems. It's the amount of money relative to what you've got. It's the proportion of your budget that you're willing to dedicate to innovation, which is important. So Formula One teams proportion a large amount of their budget to innovation because that is their priority. And it's no less true for a Formula One team that if you spend too much innovating in one area, you still have to peg yourself back in another. If you crash the car 5 times in the first 6 races and there's a massive rebuild cost, your innovation budget goes out the window for the rest of the season. That's the realities of running a business. But it's about what you prioritize. Comes back to that same thing. Formula One teams prioritize innovation because it leads to performance, and that performance comes from thinking about something that the competition hasn't thought of. That's innovation. We're operating at such a high level that you could run a Formula One team really well, do things very well. You could be really quite high performance, but that's nowhere near enough for a Formula One team. Operating at an extremely high level is the baseline for everybody. And so this is really about the proportion of your budget based on what you prioritize. If outcomes and your performance and being better than the competition is the priority, which is what it is for a Formula One team, and I appreciate that's not going to be the priority for every business out there, rightly so, and that's perfectly fine. But if you're in that competitive environment like Formula One and that is your priority, you're going to put a larger proportion of your budget, so the percentage of your overall budget is going to be larger, throwing it at innovation, understanding that that's not always an efficient process. Innovation is sometimes a step forward and 2 steps back, but that doesn't matter because the priority is getting to the end result. And if you have to take 2 steps back in Formula One to eventually get where you need to get to, and that's going to be ahead of the competition, it's worth it. With all of that in mind, you still have to balance the books, and Formula One teams are no different. The books might be at a reasonably large scale compared to a lot of companies, but that's almost irrelevant. It's the proportion of that budget, which is what matters, and what you dedicate, which proportion of that you're willing to dedicate to an area of your business, which might not be the most efficient, but might get you the big advantage that's going to mean you win the big prizes. The bookmakers in an organization, the bean counters, almost never think innovatively. There's always a battle, and that's still the same in Formula One. The financial directors in a Formula One team are the least innovative people in the organization. They're very strict, they're very straight-laced, they're just simply looking at numbers and trying to balance that and make it work. The creatives, the designers, the engineers are the opposite of that. They don't really care about the money. That's for the financial department to sort out. They want the creative side and the innovation side. And the management, the organization has to set a tone based on their priorities as to which matters most. If creative and innovation is most important, then the financial department have to make that work, and that's the difference, I think. So I do take the argument that Formula One's an expensive business, but I don't think that's the biggest issue here. I think it's the amount of their budget that they're willing to put forward to something innovative compared to, other organizations, which I think in Formula One, because it's a priority, is probably higher.
Talking about efficiency, in my industry, companies have started in the last few years talking about data-driven enterprises, which is probably something where a guy coming from Formula One is having a laugh about, because Formula One is fueled by data for decades right now, and it's getting more and more and more. It's basically the fuel for anything that you achieve in performance and innovation. What can learn companies, enterprises, firms considering data usage from Formula One? Because one remark to that, how I see many companies engaging that kind of data-driven world is just by collecting without really knowing what to do with that. How is Formula One different?
Yeah, so you're right in that data is real king in Formula One, and it has been for decades and decades. We collect an awful lot of data that's from the car, but also around the garage, around the circuit, and also from a human perspective. And if I take pit stops as an example, if you think about the pit stop as almost a microcosm of the larger organization, which you can often look at it that way, we've got a huge technical component, which is the car and the equipment. Now, all of that has sensors all over it. We're collecting data about everything, movements, G-forces. Obviously, there's the stopwatch. There's all sorts of stuff that's being collected, huge number of parameters. But actually, we also measure data from the humans that are involved in that pit stop. That's visual data from the slow-mo cameras that I talked about, heart rate data, human, health and well-being data. There are so many parameters that we look for. The number of parameters and the amount of data is irrelevant if you don't know how to use it. And that's the key that Formula One teams now spend an awful lot of time and energy on focusing how they can get the most out of the data. Because the truth is, all teams up and down the pit lane pretty much have more or less the same amounts of data. They're measuring the same parameters. They're doing it in an incredibly accurate way. They get the same data from Formula One, from from all the other teams. They've got weather data. They've got all this stuff, but everyone's got it. So the advantage is not having the data because everyone's got it. That's a level playing field. The advantage is understanding what you can do with that data. And there are enormous teams of people at every Formula One team now just dedicated to that. And of course, with the advancement of things like AI, which we're now utilizing, we've been utilizing AI in various forms for a long, long time in Formula One, but we're now utilizing it to find the best ways to optimize the data and the findings from that. And, you can find that today more and more, the hidden clues and the hidden opportunities that are buried in data that are not necessarily obvious to the naked eye, if you like, they're the things that will give you the advantage over the competition if you can find them in a more efficient way or a better way than somebody else. And it's about being creative with the data. So we've always been creative with the car and designing and coming up with components. Now we have to be creative with data. It's no different to the way that the sort of fitness wearables that we all wear on our wrists and our arms, they are coming up with more. They all collect the same data, your heart rate, because they've got your heart rate and maybe temperature. From that, they can extrapolate from that data to understand things like heart rate variability, your stress levels, your sleep patterns. And they've expanded all sorts of insights from what is a really simple data set that everybody has. Formula One teams are trying to do exactly the same thing. And AI is making that way more efficient, way more accurate, that we can extrapolate out from what is a relatively small data set. It's a lot of data, but relatively small compared to what we can now learn from it because of utilizing these very smart and clever systems together with very smart and clever people.
But still, what's interesting with all those helpers like data and AI coming up, and which is in many cases, of course, having a lot to do with delegation of decisions, from humans to machines to digital helpers. Formula One still heavily relies, and this has always been like that, to instinct. Your weather data, especially, and there have been countless examples in the past. Championship deciding race, weather data says, okay, weather will stay warm, dry, and so on. But still, there you have a guy standing on a hill few miles away, and he says like, hey, I'm soaking wet, you will get rain, although your data says something completely different. Now you have to decide on how to react on that. How do these teams reach the optimum between the human factor, the instinct on the one side, and the data-driven, let's say, non-human and intelligence-based information and decisions?
Yeah, it's a really good point, and I think it's a really valuable thing to remember that as we get swept along today with more and more data, more and more insights from data, and a lot of it is more and more accurate, I don't think we should ever lose the human perspective in this. And you make a very good point. You can be sat on the pit wall at a Grand Prix. All of your data will say it's going to start raining in 5 minutes' time. So we're thinking about strategy. And if you just looked basically at the data and made decisions based on that and didn't look out the window, you might miss the fact that it's pouring down with rain right now. And those, you see people on the pit wall sticking their hand out from, behind the pit wall to see if it's raining. It's the most basic collection of data you can imagine, but actually it's really valuable. And so, the instinct part of this, the human experience part, is something that at the moment we're nowhere near replicating with AI or with any of this machine learning stuff. We're getting incredibly good at it. And that but all of the insight that comes from machines and from AI is based on data that's already out there in the world. It's based on the internet and what's on that internet and everything that's been collected and measured and talked about in the past. The human experience part of this is something that is unique to humans at the moment. I can remember a situation in Brazil at the very final race of the year. It was the year that Lewis Hamilton won the world title in 2008. That final lap, Formula One fans listening will remember.
Past. Yeah.
So we won that race on the last corner of the last lap of the last race of the season by overtaking one car that we needed to get to the points we needed. But on that last lap, it was raining, then it was dry, and it was getting wetter and dry. It's all over the place. And we had to decide which tyres to be on. Now, we made a decision, a couple of laps earlier to jump onto wet tyres at a time when the circuit was relatively dry. It was a little bit damp, but just dry. It wasn't nowhere near ready for wet tyres. And it looked like a crazy decision. And for a lap and a half, we almost went backwards. The people in front of us were getting away. And to most people on the outside, that looks like a crazy decision, like we just messed up the World Championship. But a few seconds later, there was this downpour that was torrential. The circuit was absolutely soaked. Our tyres came alive when others around us maybe didn't. We managed to make up that final position and we became world champions. And again, I talk about this in the book in that, yes, there was an element of luck. You can't ever control the weather. There's an element of luck that's always going to be surrounding weather. But what we did do was months earlier take a decision in that team that we were going to put an awful lot of investment into loading a truck up with satellite and radar technology, which we then went up and parked up in the hills around the circuit to collect that weather in a really accurate way, more accurately than most other teams were doing at the time, with a guy in there, a meteorologist, who was able to interpret that data based on his own experiences. And he was feeding back in real time to us in the garages to make those decisions. And so whilst it looked like we'd made a desperately wrong decision, which we were then got really lucky with because the weather then came, I would look at that totally differently and say, we compared real accurate data with some valuable human experience. We came to a conclusion that on paper might have looked wrong, but we were very confident that it was going to end up right. And that's the way it played out. So that lucky moment, yes, it was lucky to some extent, but we made our own luck by basing decisions on both data and human experience. And those decisions were also made months earlier by employing that person, by building that van and getting it up there and taking the decision that was the route we were going to make. So there's always got to be a balance. And I think the human instinct, as you called it, is the most valuable thing you can have. Building experience in your company. We don't get rid of people now because of AI. We're going to get rid of a lot of people, but we need to maintain the experience in our company to manage the AI and to control the way we balance this combination of data and insight with somebody sticking a hand out the window and seeing if it's actually raining. It's going to be a more and more valuable thing because everybody who follows blindly a path of data will at some point get led down a wrong path. They'll miss a glaring opportunity because, they've got rid of all the humans. I don't think we can ever do that. Not for a long time yet. I think that valuable human experience is one of the most important things we need to retain. Even though we're going to have less numbers of people in big organizations, having the experience somewhere in the organization that can temper against the data-driven decisions and insights is going to be a really valuable insight that could give you the opportunity and the differentiator over someone who's not doing that.
Your story about the Brazil race is a perfect segue to our last segment, because back then, before Lewis Hamilton did that final pass, if I remember correctly, Felipe Massa was for 30 seconds or something like this world champion.
Yeah,
30 seconds, and then everything was put away from him. So we see that tragedy and triumph, positive emotions and negative emotions, they are so close together within seconds, but they can expand to years. Yeah, with, for example, McLaren having had a difficult time for years now, and now they're back on top again. How, from your perspective, should teams who are in that kind of situation, motivate themselves not to give up? Because we find so similar things happening right now in different industries. There was companies who are used to being successful, for example, automotive industry, who used to success was part of their daily business, are now struggling to find their way back. How do organizations and the people within organizations in the micro and macro level find the power and the right angle to turn things around again?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is that to try and avoid those disappointments, the decisions have to be made a long time ago. To, the automotive example is a good one. It's a little bit like the sort of, companies that avoid the innovation because it's more comfortable to stay where they are, miss out, and it can take years to get back. So the automotive industry should have seen the electrification coming. They should have seen the opportunity that was there of different technologies that could be embraced in both making cars and designing cars, and the user experience and all those things that new companies have done. They should have seen that. They didn't, and now they're going to pay the price. So that's the first thing. Always be looking ahead to try and avoid the disappointment is what's really going to protect you. But inevitably, disappointment is going to happen. And one of the things that we realize in Formula One teams is disappointment. It feels terrible. Everyone's down in the doldrums. It's a difficult thing to manage, but the actual knock-on impact of that is on your performance. So for us, you have a terrible race on a Sunday, we might have another race the next week. And if we're down and miserable and gloomy and beating ourselves up about what just happened on Sunday, the knock-on impact is going to run into the next race weekend, and we won't be performing in the right level. So it's a performance advantage to get over that disappointment quickly. So we put a lot of time and effort into that. One of the technique, and we've worked with a lot of professionals like sports psychologists on this. And one of the things that I was always taught that sticks with me today is, and Ron Dennis used to say this, if we had a terrible Sunday, if we had a race which had gone disastrously, which inevitably will happen at some point, you can get to the end of Sunday, you're all going to be down and miserable. You're going to be feeling low, obviously. We would learn what we could on a Sunday night through our debrief process, and we'd try and understand why things went wrong and maybe what we could do better. But then we'd set a point where a definitive point in time where we were going to mentally switch over to the next event and the next set of opportunities. Ron Dennis always used to say that he'd go to bed on a Sunday night, and on a Monday morning, when his feet swung out of the bed and landed in his slippers, as soon as his slippers went on, that was the moment when he forgot about the disappointment, and it was all eyes forward to the next set of opportunities. And it's quite a valuable process to go through. As individuals, we can choose any moment, but the process of choosing a moment is a big part of this. So you can link it to something that you do every day, like maybe it's brushing your teeth. Maybe when you brush your teeth in the morning, just mentally, you train yourself that that's the switching point. It could be any moment, but that's a good one because it's a habit that you've already got that happens every day. So when you look in the mirror, you brush your teeth in the morning, tell yourself, right, now it's all eyes forward. And that process doesn't eradicate the disappointment, of course, of what happened yesterday, but mentally it tells you, right, now there's another opportunity coming. We've learned some things from that disappointment. Let's put those in place, because otherwise we're going to miss the next opportunity as well. And this is going to spiral. So having that mental shift point, and you have to do this. This is something you have to train. It's not as simple as people listening to this and going, well, I'm going to try it tomorrow. Yeah. It probably won't work. But if you try it every time for the next 6 occasions when you have a disappointment, it might start to work. And once you've trained yourself to do that, that also becomes a habit, just like brushing your teeth. and you start to think that way naturally. It becomes your baseline. So thinking about getting over disappointment is not just about making yourself feel a little bit better. It is that, but the knock-on impact is that your performance goes up when you feel better. So the quicker you can get into that zone and seeing opportunities ahead of you rather than disappointment behind you is actually a performance differentiator. Because if you can do that quicker than your competition, well, you can see the obvious advantages. So that's a big part of what we did. It's the psychological element of disappointment. Nothing actually changes between Sunday and Monday. Nothing is going to change about what you had to do on a Sunday, what you have to do on a Monday. It's all about what's up here in your mind and the way you perceive that, the way you think about it. But as we now know, what's in your mind is a massive contributor to your performance. So the sooner you can get that into the right place and think about the next opportunity, thinking about opportunities is a real positive thing. So that switch point going into thinking of opportunities is an exciting thing. It's something that's positive. It's a way to improve and a way to get one up over the competition if that's the environment you're in. So that for me has always been a really valuable lesson I learned, and one that I still use, all of the time today.
Looking at the clock, people have learned a lot from you already, and they want to learn more, definitely. Pitlane Life Lessons is not your first book.
Pitlane Lessons is what it's
Pitlane
called.
Lessons, exactly.
Yeah, so it's slightly confusing because my podcast is Pitlane Life Lessons, but the book is Pitlane Lessons. It's not my first book. You're right. I've got a first book which I wrote, I think, sort of probably 7 years ago now. It was called The Mechanic. It was my journey, my story of my journey through Formula One. So there's a lot of valuable lessons and stuff in there, but it's a behind-the-scenes look of what it's like to work in a Formula One team. It became a bestseller. It did incredibly well. I'm very proud of it. And as a result of that, the publishers asked me for another book, which is where the Pitlane Lessons book that's just come out came from. And that really, as I said at the start, I spend a lot of my life today working with organizations to help them think like a Formula One team. This book is my attempt to help everybody, not just companies, but everybody to think about life and challenges in the way that a Formula One team would think about those same challenges. So I spent a very privileged existence that I'm very lucky and fortunate to have worked with some of the world's most elite people in a great organization during some successful times. We've won championships. We've lost championships through mistakes. All of that teaches you some really valuable stuff. Yeah. And so that's what the book is. It's all about utilizing some of the things that I've learned together with a whole bunch of research about Formula One and their teams that people can actionably put into practice to help them in their life and in their careers. So I hope it's a really useful tool for everybody, but also a little bit entertaining with some great stories too.
Absolutely. And I think it's coming absolutely at the right time, because so many people now are struggling with, world is in turmoil, industries is in turmoil. Many people are now realizing that probably the way they have worked in their jobs for the last 20, 25 years will not carry them into the future. So for many of us, disruptions in our personal career will come up. And I'm absolutely convinced that your book definitely gives very important guideline on how to do that. And that's why what I realized, I'm sure it will become a bestseller again, because my personal book is not here yet, because I found out that they actually have already problems now to deliver it. But that's why we will put several links to your book and to sources for your book into the comment section.
Thank you.
Into the to the section in the podcast. But that's not the only way to experience you. What's your plans for next weeks? Where can people meet you?
I do a lot of big events. Most of them are sort of closed private events with organizations. So I travel the world a lot. I'm off to the States in a couple of days to go and do a little sort of mini tour around LA and San Diego, again, working with organizations. But in the new year, the best thing to do is to follow me on Instagram. And I have two accounts. One is at F1 Elvis, which is all my it's more talking about Formula One. And then I have another one, which is all the stuff we've talked about today, which is at Marc_Priestley. And that's Mark with a C. And that's a lot of the stuff that is in the book and the lessons that Formula One's taught me that I try and share with people every day. So you can get me there or on LinkedIn, and any of my events that are coming up, I will share them on there if people would like to come and say hello or get involved in some way, particularly in the new year. I'm hoping to put together a little tour beginning in the UK, but it will stretch out beyond that at some point of events where people can come. We can talk about the book and about Formula One and try and work through some people's challenges, because that's effectively what this book is for.
And of course, the podcast.
And the podcast, which has been on hold because we've been making a television show for the last 6 months, which has taken all of my time. And so that, again, in the new year, will start up again. That's me bringing on guests from the world of Formula One, talking about what we've all learned from our shared experience in this sport.
Perfect. Really looking forward to that, and really looking to any new stuff that I can learn from you. I did learn a lot this recording, and I'm sure many of our listeners did. Marc, thank you very much for taking your time. It's been a great pleasure and great honor.
Well, it's been my pleasure. So thank you. Thank you for having me. And I hope everybody's enjoyed it. If you've got this far through it, well done. I hope you've learned something and enjoyed it. But appreciate the opportunity.
Awesome. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.